Story 1. The Stalker on the Ridge. I had always loved the mountains, their vastness, and the feeling of being isolated from the world. When I received an offer to house-sit a remote cabin on Ridge Mountain for a week, I jumped at the opportunity. The cabin belonged to a family friend who was out of town. It was nestled deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town, and that's exactly what drew me in. I wanted peace, solitude, and a break from the daily grind. The first few days were idyllic. I spent my mornings hiking the trails around the cabin, afternoons reading by the fireplace, and nights stargazing on the porch. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of an owl. The isolation was refreshing. Little did I know, this very isolation would soon turn into my worst nightmare. On the third night, the temperature dropped significantly, and a thick fog rolled in, blanketing the woods in an eerie silence. I was in the living room, curled up with a book, when I heard a faint rustling sound coming from outside. I froze, straining my ears. At first, I thought it was the wind or maybe a small animal, but then I heard it again, this time louder and closer. I put the book down and walked to the window, peering into the darkness. The fog made it nearly impossible to see anything beyond a few feet. I switched on the porch light, but the fog swallowed the light, barely illuminating the immediate area. I pressed my face against the glass, searching for the source of the sound, but saw nothing. Probably just an animal, I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the growing unease. I returned to the couch, picking up my book again, but I couldn't concentrate. My eyes kept drifting to the window. The sense of being watched was palpable. An hour passed in tense silence, and just as I started to relax, I heard it again this time, a distinct knock on the window. My heart leaped into my throat. It was too deliberate to be an animal. I shot up from the couch, my body trembling as I slowly approached the window. My hand shook as I reached for the curtain, hesitating before pulling it aside. Nothing. There was nothing there. I stood there, staring out into the fog, my mind racing. Someone had to be out there, but why were they toying with me? I quickly checked all the doors and windows, ensuring they were locked. I grabbed my phone and called the owner of the cabin, but it went straight to voicemail. I left a hurried message explaining what had happened, then sat down, clutching my phone, my eyes fixed on the window. The night dragged on in unnerving silence. I finally managed to drift off to sleep on the couch, but it was a restless, uneasy sleep filled with vague, disturbing dreams. I woke up at dawn, the fog still clinging to the forest. I decided to go outside and check for any signs of a visitor. The ground around the cabin was damp from the fog, and as I circled the building, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, in the mud beneath the living room window, were footprints. They were large and deep, leading away from the window and disappearing into the woods. My stomach twisted in fear. Someone had been watching me, standing right outside the window as I sat inside, oblivious. I rushed back into the cabin, my heart pounding. I didn't know what to do. The nearest town was miles away, and my car was parked at the end of a long dirt road that twisted through the woods. I felt trapped, cut off from any help. I decided to stay inside and wait for the family friend to call back, hoping he would have some explanation or advice. Hours passed. I kept myself busy, trying to ignore the creeping fear that gnawed at me. By nightfall, the fog had thickened again, and the cabin felt more isolated than ever. I locked all the doors and windows, drawing the curtains tightly shut. I turned on every light in the cabin, bathing the rooms in a warm, artificial glow. But then, as I was about to settle down for the night, the power went out. I stood there, bathed in darkness, the only light coming from the flashlight I quickly grabbed from the kitchen drawer. I shined it around the room, my breath shaky. I tried to stay calm, telling myself it was just a power outage, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The silence was suffocating. I listened intently, straining to hear any sound, and then it came a low, guttural whisper, so faint I almost thought I was imagining it. It was coming from the back door. My grip tightened on the flashlight as I slowly approached the door, my heart hammering in my chest. I shined the light at the door, and my blood ran cold. There on the glass pane of the door was a handprint, fresh, wet, and smeared across the glass as if someone had pressed their hand against it and dragged it down. The whispering continued, unintelligible and haunting. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. I had to get out of there. I grabbed my car keys and rushed to the front door, yanking it open. I stepped out into the fog, the cold air hitting me like a wall. I shined the flashlight towards the car, parked about 50 feet away at the edge of the trees. And that's when I saw him. A figure stood by the car, tall and motionless, partially obscured by the fog. He was wearing dark clothing, his face hidden in the shadows. He just stood there, staring at me. I felt a scream rising in my throat, but it wouldn't come out. My legs refused to move as terror rooted me to the spot. Then he began to move, slowly walking toward me. Each step was deliberate, like he was savoring the moment. The whispering grew louder, echoing through the fog, though his mouth never moved. I backed away, stumbling into the cabin and slamming the door shut. I locked it and ran to the bedroom, barricading myself inside. I called 911, my voice barely coherent as I explained what was happening. They said they would send someone, but it would take time. I stayed in that room, clutching the flashlight, listening to the whispering that seemed to surround the cabin. It felt like an eternity before I heard the distant sound of sirens. When the police arrived, the whispering stopped. They searched the property and the woods but found nothing. No footprints, no sign of the man. They dismissed it as a prank or a trespasser, but I knew it was something more. I left the cabin that night, never to return. To this day, I don't know who or what was watching me in that cabin. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when I'm alone and the world is quiet, I hear that whispering again, faint and distant, as if it's still out there, waiting for me. Story 2. The Mirror in Room 13. I've always been fascinated by old buildings. The architecture, the history, and the stories they seem to whisper through their cracked walls and creaky floors. So, when I had the opportunity to stay at the Grand Orleans Hotel, a Victorian-era establishment known for its haunted reputation, I couldn't resist. It was a rainy weekend in late October, the perfect setting for a few days of solitude and perhaps a few ghost stories. The hotel was an imposing structure, standing tall against the dreary sky. Its once white façade had yellowed with age, and ivy crept up the walls, encasing it in a web of green. I checked in at the front desk, where an elderly receptionist gave me a polite but curt smile. She handed me the key to my room 13, the very room rumored to be the most haunted in the entire hotel. "You're brave," she said in a tone that wavered between admiration and pity. I chuckled nervously. "So they say," I replied, trying to mask my growing unease. I had read about the tales surrounding Room 13, stories of guests experiencing strange visions, objects moving on their own, and most famously, the mirror on the far wall that was said to reflect things that weren't really there. I made my way up the grand staircase, the old wood groaning under my weight. The hallways were dimly lit, the sconces casting long, wavering shadows along the walls. I found room 13 at the end of the corridor. The door was old, its paint peeling, with the brass number 13 hanging slightly askew. I hesitated for a moment before inserting the key and turning the lock. The room was exactly what I expected, small, with an antique bed, a wooden dresser, and a single chair placed near the window. The wallpaper was faded, and the air inside was heavy with the scent of dust and age. But it was the mirror that drew my attention, a large, ornate frame that hung on the wall opposite the bed. Its glass was slightly cloudy, with a patina of age that gave it a murky, almost liquid appearance. I set my suitcase on the bed and walked over to the mirror. I stared at my reflection for a moment, feeling an odd sensation of vertigo, as if the reflection was just a fraction of a second slower than my movements. I shook off the feeling and unpacked my things, deciding to explore the town before the weather worsened. The rest of the day passed uneventfully. I returned to the hotel at dusk, the rain now coming down in sheets. I felt a chill as I walked through the lobby, an unsettling quietness hanging in the air. I climbed the stairs to my room, feeling a strange sense of dread with each step. When I entered room 13, I immediately noticed at the mirror. Something was off. The chair that had been near the window was now positioned in front of the mirror, as if someone had moved it while I was gone. A shiver ran down my spine. I distinctly remembered where I had seen the chair before I left. I hesitated, then walked over and moved the chair back to its original place near the window. I told myself it was just the staff, maybe the cleaning crew, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I settled in for the night, but sleep didn't come easily. The wind howled outside, and the rain lashed against the windows. I lay in bed, staring at the mirror in the dim light, feeling as if it was watching me. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt an inexplicable urge to look at it again. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. I woke up suddenly, gasping for breath. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside. I felt a presence, an unshakable feeling that I wasn't alone. My eyes darted to the mirror, and my blood ran cold. There, in the reflection, was a figure. A woman, standing in the corner of the room, her back to me. She was draped in a dark, tattered dress, her long hair matted and hanging over her shoulders. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned to look at the corner, but it was empty. I looked back at the mirror. She was still there, standing motionless, her figure blurry and indistinct in the murky glass. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed with fear. I watched in horror as the woman in the mirror slowly turned her head, her movements unnatural and jerky, like a puppet on strings. Her face came into view, but it wasn't a face. It was a void, a black abyss where her features should have been, as if her identity had been erased. She raised her hand and pointed at me, her finger long and skeletal. I backed away, stumbling out of bed, my eyes never leaving the mirror. As I moved, the reflection didn't mimic my movements. It was as if I was looking at a scene from another world, a place where the rules of reality didn't apply. I fumbled for the light switch, but when I turned it on, the room remained dark. The only light was from the mirror, which now seemed to glow faintly, illuminating the woman's ghastly form. She began to move toward the edge of the mirror, her hand reaching out as if she was trying to step through the glass. My survival instincts kicked in. I grabbed the chair by the window and hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered with an ear-piercing crash, shards scattering across the room. I stood there, panting, staring at the broken fragments. The reflection was gone. The room was empty. I backed away slowly, my body trembling. I had to get out of there. I grabbed my suitcase and bolted for the door. I didn't care about the mess I left behind. I needed to leave that room, that hotel, as fast as possible. As I reached the hallway, the lights flickered back on. I looked back at the shattered mirror one last time, and my blood turned to ice. In one of the larger shards that remained on the wall, I saw her again, the woman, standing in the center of the room, looking directly at me. Her void-like face seemed to warp, twisting into a semblance of a smile, a dark, malevolent grin that sent a wave of terror through my entire being. I ran down the corridor, not stopping until I reached the lobby. The receptionist looked up in surprise as I rushed past her, out into the rain. I drove away from that place, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I never went back for my things. The hotel called me the next day, asking about the incident, but I didn't care. I told them to keep whatever was left. I didn't want anything that had been in that room. To this day, I can't look at a mirror without feeling that same dread. I avoid them whenever possible, afraid that if I look too long, I'll see her again. That thing, that dark, hollow figure that watches and waits just beyond the glass. Story 3. The Voice in the Basement. I had been renting an old townhouse on the outskirts of the city. The place was cheap and had a certain charm with its vintage decor and creaky wooden floors. I moved in during the summer, appreciating the coolness of the house compared to the heat outside. But it wasn't long before I started noticing the oddities. It began with small things, objects moved from where I had left them, doors creaking open on their own. At first, I attributed it to the house's age. Old houses have their quirks, I told myself. They settle, they creak, they groan in the night. But it was the basement that bothered me the most. The basement door was situated at the end of a narrow hallway on the first floor, and it was always cold near the door, no matter how hot it was in the rest of the house. The air around it felt thick, as if the basement held its own atmosphere. I avoided going down there, partly because of its ominous feel and partly because I had no reason to. But the basement had a way of calling to me. One night, as I was settling in with a movie, I heard it for the first time, a faint, rhythmic knocking coming from the basement. It was subtle, almost too soft to hear over the hum of the TV. I muted the movie and listened, my heart quickening. The knocking continued, steady and deliberate, like someone tapping on a wall. I stood up, my eyes fixed on the basement door. My mind raced through the possibilities: pipes, the house settling, maybe even an animal. But this knocking had a pattern, a rhythm that didn't match anything natural. I approached the door slowly, each step echoing in the quiet room. I placed my hand on the doorknob, hesitating for a moment. Then, with a deep breath, I turned the knob and pulled the door open. Darkness greeted me, the basement descending into a pitch-black void. The knocking stopped abruptly, leaving an unsettling silence that pressed against my ears. I fumbled for the light switch and flipped it on. The single bulb at the top of the stairs flickered to life, casting weak light down the narrow staircase. I peered down into the basement, but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the concrete floor, the old water heater, and shelves stacked with forgotten boxes from previous tenants. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I closed the door, locking it behind me. I convinced myself it was nothing and went back to my movie, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The knocking continued over the next few nights, always coming from the basement and always stopping the moment I opened the door. It was as if whatever was down there knew I was listening. The unease grew, turning into a gnawing fear that kept me awake at night. I avoided the basement, but the knocking persisted, becoming louder and more insistent. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, I came home to find the basement door ajar. I froze in the hallway, my pulse quickening. I knew I had locked it before leaving. I approached the door cautiously, pushing it open with a trembling hand. The basement light was off. the darkness below impenetrable. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing down the staircase. Silence. I fumbled for the light switch, but when I flipped it on, the bulb flickered and went out. The darkness seemed to swell, reaching up the stairs like a living thing. And then, from the depths of the basement, I heard a voice. It was a soft, whispering voice, echoing up from the darkness. It was distorted, as if it was coming from a great distance, the words unintelligible, but filled with a cold, sinister intent. My heart pounded in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to shut the door and run. But I stood there, rooted to the spot, straining to make out the words. The whispering grew louder, a cacophony of voices layering over each other, creating a chilling symphony that filled the air around me. And then, among the chaos of whispers, I heard my name. My blood turned to ice. The voice called my name again, clearer this time, the tone mocking and malevolent. It sounded like ... me. It was my voice, calling out from the darkness, distorted and twisted. I stumbled back, slamming the door shut, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I locked the door, backed away, and grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I called the landlord. The landlord arrived an hour later, clearly annoyed by my frantic call. I explained what had been happening, my words tumbling out in a jumbled mess. He listened, his expression skeptical, but agreed to check the basement with me. Armed with a flashlight, we opened the basement door. The light from his flashlight cut through the darkness as we descended the stairs. The basement was as it always had been, cold, damp, and empty. He shined the light around, revealing nothing but the concrete walls and the cluttered shelves. "You see," he said, his voice tinged with impatience. "There's nothing here. Old houses make noise." I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and lingering dread. Maybe I was imagining things, letting the isolation of the house get to me. But as we turned to leave, the flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment the basement was plunged into darkness. In that split second, I saw it. A figure standing at the far corner of the basement, tall and shadowy, its face obscured. It was there, and then it was gone, as the flashlight's beam returned. My breath hitched, and I grabbed the landlord's arm. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "See what?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. I pointed to the corner, but it was empty. He shook his head, muttering about my imagination, and led me back up the stairs. We locked the basement door, and he left, dismissing my fears as the product of an overactive mind. But I knew what I had seen. That night, the knocking was louder, more aggressive, accompanied by the whispering voice that echoed through the house. I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my things, intending to leave the next morning. I needed to get out of that house. As I lay in bed, unable to sleep, I heard the basement door creak open. My heart stopped. I lay there, listening, as the knocking turned into a slow, deliberate tapping, moving closer and closer. The air grew cold, and the whispering filled the room, my name repeated over and over in that twisted, mocking tone. I sat up, my eyes fixed on the bedroom door. Shadows moved under the doorframe, flickering as if something was standing just outside. And then the door handle began to turn slowly, as if someone was trying to open it from the other side. I bolted upright, grabbed my keys, and fled the house without looking back. I drove through the night, not stopping until I reached a friend's place miles away. I never returned to that townhouse. The landlord called, asking about my sudden departure, but I refused to go back. I couldn't face whatever was in that basement. To this day, I don't know what was down there, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, when I'm alone in a quiet room, I hear it, the faint knocking and the voice whispering my name, as if it's still trying to reach me, still calling from the darkness. Hey there, it's Mr. Night Horror. If you enjoyed this eerie journey and want to dive deeper into the shadows with us, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back with more spine-chilling tales tomorrow. Stay haunted.